My name is Willa Mayford. I'm 72 years old, a retired estate planner, and for most of my adult life, I believed that quiet dignity was the best form of self-defense. That belief held me together through a war-torn childhood, a late marriage to a powerful man, and years of side glances at charity galas I wasn't born into. But nothing tested my silence more than that weekend in late autumn, when the sun set behind the pines and my stepson Gregory whispered through gritted teeth, "Enjoy the warmth while you can." Then he turned the bolt from the outside. His wife, Celeste, didn't say a word. Her white coat fluttered like a flag of surrender as she stepped off the porch, heels clicking against the old wood. I sat still by the unlit fireplace, the air heavy with pine resin and the faint, deliberate scent of gas. They thought it was a farewell weekend. They called it a getaway, champagne, sunset, and a plan to erase me without raising their voices. But they underestimated one thing. They thought the $9.9 billion trust Richard left behind was theirs the moment I was gone. What they didn't know was that when they came home to celebrate, I'd be sitting there with the judge and a court order they never saw coming. That weekend was supposed to be my goodbye. Instead, it became the beginning of something they never expected. The moment I heard the lock click, I stopped breathing for a second. Not out of fear, out of recognition. You can tell when someone's done pretending. Gregory's voice didn't shake. Celeste's smile didn't twitch. They had rehearsed this. I heard the gravel crunch beneath the weight of their car, the pause as the engine turned, and then silence. Complete. Clean, intentional. I didn't panic. I placed the wine glass on the floor. It wasn't even opened. They'd meant to toast but didn't want to waste the bottle. A flicker of orange caught my eye from the corner of the room. The old gas heater hummed a little louder than usual. The scent grew stronger. It wasn't enough to ignite right away. It was enough to trap. A slow burn. A silent erasure. That was always Celeste's style. I got up, slowly. My joints still remembered the garden, not the courtroom. I touched the wooden beams near the windows. No handles. They'd installed them to slide from outside, only during one of their renovations I laughed, softly, because when your enemy thinks you're weak, they grow careless. And when they think you're already gone, you become powerful in ways they can't predict. You see, this cabin wasn't always a crime scene. It was once where Richard and I spent 2 weeks every fall. Just us, away from the noise of city boardrooms and trust documents. He'd write. I'd press flowers between ledger pages. We didn't need words to feel close. The cabin still smelled of cedar and the lavender oil I used on his neck after radiation treatments. He died 3 years ago. But what he left me wasn't just money. He left me the blueprints of their greed, and I'd kept them quiet. Until now. That night, inside that locked room, surrounded by firewood and false smiles, still hanging in the air. I knew it was time. It wasn't about revenge. It was about memory, about legacy, and about what a woman can do when everything she ever protected turns against her. Before I take you back to how it all began, how my husband's only son went from polite indifference to slow-burn betrayal, let me ask you something. Have you ever sat in a room with someone who's already decided you no longer matter? That's what silence feels like, not absence, erasure. And I was done being erased. If you've ever been left behind by the very people you raised, trusted, or once called family, stay with me. Because what happened next didn't just restore what was taken. It redefined what power looks like in a woman's 70s, especially one they thought was finished. Let me tell you what they didn't see coming. Richard Mayford wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room quietly. Even when he entered with silence, the atmosphere shifted, like someone had opened a window that only let in power. He was 30 years my senior, a legend in clean energy long before it became a buzzword. We met at a symposium on sustainable architecture, of all places. I was a mid-level planner at a nonprofit. He was the keynote speaker. I asked a question about water rights, and he answered with an invitation to dinner. The press called it a May-December romance, but they missed the part where I didn't need his money. And he didn't need my youth. What we both needed, quietly, was solace. A place to land after lives that had asked too much, too early. Richard had been married before. Her name was Elaine. She passed away in her 40s, and they had one son, Gregory. When I met him, Gregory was in his late 20s, freshly married to a woman named Celeste, and already fluent in the language of quiet entitlement, polite but glacial. "Nice to meet you," he'd said that first dinner, but what his eyes said was, "You're temporary." To be fair, I didn't expect Gregory to embrace me. I wasn't looking for a new son. What I hoped for was respect, civility, maybe in time a sort of friendship. Instead, I became the paper wall between him and his father's empire. Richard never said much about Gregory's childhood. I pieced it together through gaps, boarding schools, absences, letters that were returned unopened, a mother who had shaped him in her own image, then left him too soon. And when he looked at me, I could feel the resentment coil in his throat, not because I did anything wrong, but because I was there, present, constant still. I tried. I sent birthday gifts, thoughtful ones. I invited them to dinners, to exhibitions, even hosted a small garden party when Celeste got her new position at the firm. She barely touched the hors d'oeuvres. Gregory barely looked up from his phone. But Richard saw everything. In his final years, when the cancer came like winter, he called me his quiet engine. I was the one who held his hand through the transfusions, memorized the nurse rotations, logged every medication. I learned to cook the blandest soup known to man, just so he could keep down 2 spoonfuls. I read aloud his old journals when his vision failed. I watched him fade, not as a wife desperate to save him, but as a woman determined to honor the end. It was during one of those evenings, hospice silence, IV drip metronome in the background, that he told me about the trust. "Everything will go through you," he said. His voice had thinned into paper, but the words still cut clean. "You've protected more than the money, Willa. You've protected me." I didn't cry then. I only nodded, my hand on his, our wedding ring warm between 2 lives drawn together by timing, not biology. He never said Gregory wouldn't understand. He only said, "He'll fight it." But you know what's real, and I did. Because the truth is, biology is not the same as loyalty. Blood may connect, but care is what roots. And I had cared. Day in, day out. In silence, without applause, without even the assumption of inheritance. The documents were airtight. Richard had made sure of that. I reviewed them with the legal team myself. The Mayford Clean Earth Trust, valued at just over $9.9 billion, would funnel into educational initiatives, community grants, and long-term global partnerships. I would be the steward, not the owner, not the benefactor, but the executor of a vision. What Gregory and Celeste assumed, however, was much simpler. They believed that once Richard was gone, they would step into the throne. What they didn't see, or perhaps refused to, was that legacy is not passed down by default. It's entrusted. After Richard's funeral, the calls began, short, clipped ones from Gregory, always laced with a false calm. "So, what's next for the trust? Have you spoken to the board yet? Just wondering when we'll sit down to discuss the transfer." No mention of grief, no "how are you?" Just business cloaked in sonship. I answered kindly, firmly, without apology. "We'll follow the plan Richard laid out." The silence on the other end of the line was always louder than his words. Then the invitations started. They were disguised as kindness. Dinners, weekend retreats, one particularly lavish offer to join them in Aspen. But I recognized it. A new strategy. Charm where pressure hadn't worked, and I wanted to believe, for just a moment, that maybe this was reconciliation, that maybe my patients had thawed something in them, that the years I gave, the love I offered without demand, had finally taken root. So when they invited me to the cabin that autumn weekend, saying it was for closure, I said yes, not because I trusted them, but because I needed to know. I needed to see what kind of fire they were willing to build. 3 days after Richard's funeral, the house began to shift. I don't mean metaphorically, I mean physically. Furniture moved, locks changed, staff dismissed. One by one, little anchors of familiarity disappeared, like the home was being peeled back to make space for someone else's story. Gregory and Celeste returned from their so-called grieving retreat in Napa with a brisk efficiency that didn't match the black they wore. They arrived with boxes of documents, a lawyer I'd never seen before, and an agenda that didn't require my presence, only my obedience. "We've located a revision to Dad's will," Gregory announced, not looking up from the manila folder in his hand. "It names me as the sole beneficiary." He said it without hesitation, like the matter was both final and boring. I sat across from him in the living room Richard once called his thinking space, the same room where I had watched the sun warm his fading skin, where we'd shared our last cup of mint tea. Gregory placed the folder on the table like it was a menu. Celeste leaned back, her arms folded, her eyes trained on me with the calm of someone already victorious. I asked for a copy to review. "You don't need one," Gregory said smoothly. "It's already notarized." Filed. This is just a courtesy. I remember that word because it echoed strangely in the air, as though courtesy had ever been part of the plan. The document itself was an obvious fabrication to anyone who had spent more than a week around Richard. The language was off, cold, transactional, lacking his signature precision. He would never refer to me as the spouse of record. He called me his lighthouse. But I said nothing that day, just sat with my hands folded in my lap, watching the gleam of Gregory's cufflinks, watching Celeste's foot tap against the marble floor in a syncopated rhythm that sounded like time running out. That evening, Marvin called. His voice was low, hesitant, like someone standing near a cliff's edge. Marvin had been Richard's legal counsel for over 2 decades, a man of few words and airtight contracts. He was the one who'd helped structure the trust, who ensured every clause served Richard's long-term vision, not just Gregory's short-term ambition. "I'm stepping back from this," Marvin said quietly, "but I left something for you." "At the old office, locked drawer. Envelope marked with your name, why?" I asked, already fearing the answer. "I can't say much, Willa. Just don't sign anything, don't withdraw, you're not crazy." And then he hung up. The next morning, I was no longer allowed into the study. Gregory's assistant, a girl younger than my niece, handed me a cardboard box with 3 framed photos, a sweater, and the last of my stationery. She didn't meet my eyes. I moved to the guest house behind the rose garden, a space once used for interns and overflow relatives, now my exile. My access to bank accounts was paused, pending clarification of estate matters. My name was removed from board communication chains. My seat at the foundation meetings was suddenly under review. And still, I said nothing, because I knew grief had a longer tail than Gregory understood, because Marvin had never once used the word "don't" with me, not in 20 years. And now he'd used it twice in one sentence. That night, I opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of the real trust, dated, signed, notarized, and filed months before Richard's health collapsed. It was the version I remembered, my name listed not as beneficiary, but as executive steward, with full authority to enact and protect the mission of the Mayford Trust. Gregory's role was advisory, and only upon approval. Celeste's name appeared nowhere. There was also a letter, short, in Marvin's handwriting. "They will try to drown you in silence. but truth has its own voice. Wait. Move only when the floor beneath you is real. I folded the letter and placed it under the drawer lining in my nightstand. In the main house, champagne was popped the next evening. I saw them through the glass, celebrating something quietly. Celeste wore a white silk dress. Gregory had his arm around her waist. They danced without music, toasted to futures already claimed. And I stood in the dark of the guesthouse kitchen, barefoot, holding a teacup with both hands. They thought they had won. They thought I had nowhere else to go, but some of us don't disappear. We wait. The cabin sat on the edge of the woods like an afterthought. It had once been Richard's sacred place, a cedar-walled retreat where he wrote his essays on ethical wealth and clean energy policy. He used to say the silence of the forest was the only thing louder than Wall Street. I used to bring him lunch there, a simple sandwich and ginger tea, and he'd greet me with ink on his fingers and the same boyish smile I fell in love with. Now it was my exile. They didn't ask me to leave the main house. They simply made it impossible to stay. Locks changed, staff gone, access revoked. The guest house became a waiting room, and when I refused to leave, they suggested I take a more suitable space to clear my mind. That space, conveniently, was the cabin. It hadn't been used in years. Dust layered the shelves, mice had found the pantry, and the generator sputtered like an old man wheezing through winter. But it was mine, or had been. I lit the fireplace, opened the windows, and claimed the silence again. The first week, I sorted through Richard's boxes, his handwritten drafts, his marked-up blueprints. I wasn't searching for anything specific, just a sense of him, of us. Between the pages of one notebook, I found a pressed violet. I'd once slipped it into his coat, pocket after a fight, back when we still had time to argue over silly things. I didn't cry. There's something about betrayal that burns too slow for tears. One morning, a white SUV pulled up near the cabin. A woman in a beige coat stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the place like she was looking at a rehab project. "Mrs. Mayford?" she asked with a rehearsed softness. "I am," I replied, not stepping off the porch. "I'm Dr. Elkins from the County Mental Health Department. I received a referral regarding concerns about your well-being and mental clarity, particularly in light of recent estate complications." The word complications hung in the air like mildew. I knew exactly who had sent her. Celeste never said things directly. She implied, suggested, delegated. And this was her way of putting doubt on record, a smear dressed as concern. "Would you mind if I came in and asked a few questions?" the woman continued. "This isn't an evaluation, just a check-in." I let her in. I made her tea. I answered her questions with more clarity than she expected, perhaps more than she liked. I told her the year, the president, the street I grew up on, and the reason I chose to stay. "Do you feel threatened here?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I am being erased." Quietly, strategically. She blinked. "Do you believe someone is out to harm you?" "I believe some people are very good at hiding knives inside wedding toasts and sympathy cards." She made a note. I didn't ask what it said. When she left, she looked uncertain, not convinced of my sanity, but not sure of my madness either. That suited me fine. I spent the next few days sorting files. Richard had always kept duplicates of everything. Handwritten notes, draft clauses, early correspondence with Marvin about how to protect the trust from hostile intent. Most people thought his legacy was his money. It wasn't. It was his mind, his foresight, and they hadn't touched that. At night, I typed. The old Royal typewriter Richard gave me on our first anniversary still sat on the writing desk. My fingers remembered its rhythm. Clack, clack, pause, ding. I began to document everything, not just what they had done, but how they had done it. Every detail, every erasure, every manipulation cloaked in legalese and false sentiment. I wrote not because I needed to prove anything to the world, but because I needed to remind myself I was still here, still capable, still lucid. They hadn't broken me, not yet. One afternoon, I caught Celeste watching from the tree line. She wore sunglasses, but I recognized the posture, the assessment. She didn't wave, just turned and walked back toward the main estate. I wasn't a threat to them, not anymore. I was the ghost of an inconvenience, tucked away in a cabin with old papers and older memories, or so they thought. They didn't know I still had the real trust. They didn't know about the duplicate power of executorship, notarized and quietly stored in a bank deposit box across the state line. They didn't know Marvin had taught me well, and most of all, they didn't know I remembered everything, because I had learned silence can be a sanctuary or a strategy, and sometimes the one you exile to the woods is the one who walks back with fire. Walter came to the cabin one afternoon with a backpack full of wires and a screwdriver that looked older than he was. His mother, Celeste, had likely assumed he was off skateboarding or glued to a screen somewhere. But Walter wasn't like most boys his age. He was quieter, more precise. And he had a gift, not just with machines, but with patterns. I'd noticed it early on, back when he used to follow Richard around the workshop, asking about voltage and resistance and how to solder circuits without burning your fingertips. Now at 17, he was all long limbs and thoughtful silences. He moved like he was used to being invisible, which made him perfect company for someone who'd become invisible by force. "Thought you might need help with the carriage return," he said, gesturing toward the typewriter. "It's sticking again." I nodded. "It only likes people it trusts." He gave a half smile and crouched beside the desk. Within seconds, he had the machine open, hands working like memory was muscle. He didn't ask why I was typing or what I was writing. He didn't need to. Instead, he said, "Did you know the old office safe still has a paper log in it?" My heart didn't move, but my breath did. "I didn't," I said carefully. "You've been in there?" He nodded, still fiddling with the roller. "Mom and Gregory think I'm dumb, so they don't notice what I see." I saw him open it once, 2 summers ago. He changed the code after Grandfather died, but I remembered the way his fingers moved. He used to type with 2 fingers. He presses numbers the same way. Index, index, middle, ring, index. It was 2-8-5-3-1. He said it like he was listing ingredients. "You're sure?" I asked. He nodded again. "I tried it a few weeks ago when no one was around." "It still works." I didn't react, at least not on the outside. Walter was the one variable they hadn't accounted for. He wasn't blood to Richard, not by name or paper. He wasn't legally tied to the trust, not in the way Celeste was trying to position herself, but he was here, observant, untouched by the entitlement that curdled everyone else. He got the typewriter working again and sat across from me on the floor, pulling out a sandwich. "Do you think they know what they're doing?" I looked at him, truly looked at him, at the boy Celeste had raised to be obedient, not loyal. "I think some people confuse taking with earning," I said. He didn't respond right away. Then quietly, "I liked Grandfather." He listened. "Even when I was annoying, you were never annoying," I said. "You were curious." That scared them. He gave a small laugh, then reached for a notebook from his bag. It was filled with sketches, mechanical parts, door hinges, schematic-looking maps of the estate, down to the garden sheds and irrigation systems. He'd drawn the safe, too, from memory, even the keypad wear marks. "He kept a red envelope inside," Walter said, "with seals on it." I didn't open it. "You did right," I told him, "but I may need your help soon." Quietly, his eyes lit up, not in mischief, but in meaning, in purpose. Like someone had finally seen him as more than a boy to be managed. That night, I sat by the fire thinking of how Richard used to call Walter a second draft. Not a correction of Gregory, but a new blueprint. Where Gregory had demanded, Walter observed. Where Gregory plotted, Walter considered. They were raised in different worlds. Gregory had grown up with the scent of entitlement in his nose. Walter, though, he breathed in silences, tucked himself in corners, and watched everything. That made him dangerous to people like Celeste, and invaluable to someone like me. The next morning, he returned with a Polaroid camera. "In case you want to keep records," he said, handing it to me like an offering. "It's analog. Can't be hacked." I almost smiled. I didn't tell him what I was planning. Not yet. But I let him help me organize Richard's papers. File by file, page by page. His photographic memory made the task move like a dance. He remembered where each document had been left, even the ones I hadn't touched in weeks. When I misplaced one of Richard's earliest trust drafts, Walter found it between two gardening books, exactly where Richard had once said he hid things he couldn't bear to shred. "Was he scared of them?" Walter asked as he handed it to me. I took a breath. No, but he feared what greed does to people. Even good ones, Walter nodded as if that made perfect sense. He stayed until dusk that day, helping me label envelopes, seal letters, and log contents. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. I didn't have a son, but in that moment I realized I had something rarer. An ally. One with a perfect memory, quiet footsteps, and no need for credit. They had locked me out of my life. But Walter had just handed me the first key back. The phone rang just after 4 when the shadows outside the cabin began to stretch long and the birds quieted like they knew something was coming. I didn't recognize the number, but something in my chest stirred. A subtle tightening, like a thread pulling taut. "Hello?" I answered, my voice sharper than usual. "Willa." The voice was hoarse, tired, but unmistakable. "Marvin. Marvin, where have you been?" "You disappeared." There was a pause on the other end. Then, softer, "They made me disappear." My hand gripped the edge of the table. "Where are you?" "A facility. In Oregon. It's called Meadow Pine. Sounds peaceful, doesn't it?" he said with a bitter laugh. "They called it a retirement transition. Said I was showing signs of fatigue. Said it would be best for everyone if I stepped down from the Mayford account." I blinked, stunned. "You didn't step down?" "No, I was removed. Silently, cleanly. The same way they removed you." The silence between us was dense. "Marvin, why are you calling now?" I asked. He exhaled. "Because I don't know how much time I have, and someone slipped me a burner phone while I was on a supervised walk. I don't have long." My stomach turned. "Willa," he continued, his voice steadying, "you were right not to trust the revised will. But you need to understand something deeper. The trust itself was never tied to the will. Richard separated them intentionally after his second surgery. He said, 'Wills are too easy to contest.' Trusts are like veins underground. You only see them when someone digs." I closed my eyes. I remembered that conversation. Richard had been frail but lucid. He drew diagrams on napkins, talked about invisible scaffolding, legal architecture meant to outlast lies. "It's not the documents they're waving around that matter," Marvin said. "It's the statement of intentions, the one Richard kept off record, handwritten. Only you and I knew about it. He refused to let it be digitized, said it would be his final word, his moral will, even if the legal one got buried." I froze. "Where is it?" "I don't know anymore. He moved it the month before he passed, said you'd know how to find it, that she'll understand when the cold sets in." That made no sense to me, but maybe it will to you. I wrote the phrase down, "when the cold sets in." "Marvin, if I find it, will it hold up?" "If you're alive," he said quietly, "it will." That sentence hung between us like a stone in water. And then he added, "Willa, the real trust grants full enforcement powers to the named steward. You, not Gregory, not Celeste, you. But without the statement of intentions, your authority can still be undermined. If they can convince the court you're unstable, unfit, or absent. I understood then what the psychiatrist had been for. Why Celeste smiled so much when she talked about peace and letting go. Why I was being slowly erased, not attacked. If I die, I whispered. The trust reverts to Gregory by default, Marvin finished. They don't need to fight you, Willa. They just need to outlive you. Quietly, a sharp chill crawled up my spine. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees rustled like they knew. Why didn't you tell me all this sooner? I tried, Marvin said, but they cut off my access. You were already isolated. I think they wanted it to look like you'd lost your grasp. The guest house, the letters, the quiet accusations, it's all part of the erosion I swallowed hard. You said I'm the only other person who knew about the statement. What if they know that too? He didn't respond for a moment. Then quietly, then you're not just an obstacle. You're the only firewall left. I felt it fully then. The danger, the stillness of it. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, methodical undoing. Can you get out? I asked him. No, but don't worry about me. My job was never to fight them. It was to delay them. The line crackled. You have to find it, Willa. And when you do, don't store it. Show it. Loud, public. Let the light hit it. I will, I promised. A soft knock echoed at the cabin door. I have to go, Marvin whispered. They check in every hour. Remember, they can fake papers. They can forge signatures, but they can't fabricate truth. You lived beside him. You saw the intention. You are the intent. The call ended. I sat still for a long while. The tea had gone cold in my cup. My hands trembled slightly as I set it down. They hadn't just wanted the money. They wanted silence. Erasure, a legacy rewritten without resistance. But as long as I breathed, the truth had breath too, and I had no intention of letting it die first. It was a Thursday morning when Gregory showed up at my doorstep, all polished charm and teeth that didn't reach his eyes. I hadn't seen him in person since Richard's memorial, not without lawyers or intermediaries, and the sight of him on my porch made the air feel thinner. Willa, he said, as though we were merely estranged neighbors. We'd like to put all this unpleasantness behind us. Celeste and we want to offer you a gesture of peace. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He continued, We've been thinking. It's time we talk. Just the three of us. Somewhere private. Somewhere meaningful. He paused for effect. The old cabin. This weekend I stared at him. The old cabin. The place Richard and I built to get away from noise? The place that still smelled like cedar and typewriter ink? Gregory saw my hesitation and stepped forward. We'll make it comfortable. Champagne, firewood, some good food. Think of it as a farewell gathering. We've all lost a lot. No need to drag things further. Maybe we can find a way to redistribute things fairly. Like family. I bit the inside of my cheek. He pulled an envelope from his coat. Here's the itinerary. We'll send someone to pick you up Saturday morning. No pressure, of course. He placed it on the bench and left before I could answer. I didn't open the envelope. I didn't need to. I knew what it contained. An illusion of civility. Scripted lines to dress a trap in Sunday clothes. That evening, Walter came by as usual, his arms full of printer paper and books. He looked more tense than usual. Is it true? He asked, barely inside the door. Are you going to the cabin? I nodded slowly. It appears I've been extended an olive branch. He set the papers down hard. My mom's been acting weird. Hushed calls, whispering things like clean exit and tie it up at the cabin. I heard her talking to Uncle Greg. She said, if she won't sign it there, she won't be a problem anymore. My breath caught. Walter's voice dropped. She also said something about no cell signal in that part of the woods. That it would be quiet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Don't go," he said, pleading. "It's not worth it." I reached for his hand. "I appreciate you warning me, but sometimes the only way out is through. I need to see how far they're willing to go." He hesitated. "If you do go, hide something. Take something they don't expect." I looked at the leather satchel near the fireplace. Inside, the coded folder Marvin once insisted I keep. I hadn't touched it in years. Perhaps now was the time. The morning of the trip, I dressed in soft layers and tied my hair low. I packed light, a single bag, a scarf, a folder, no cell phone. I knew they'd take it from me anyway. When the car arrived, the driver didn't speak. Just nodded, opened the back door, and pulled away from the house before I fully settled into my seat. As the cabin road approached, I felt the air change, crisper, heavier. The forest pressed in on either side, the light shifting through tall pines like a warning in Morse code. I rested my hand against the cold glass of the window. The wind howled just slightly, a high whisper. They thought this was the end of the story, but they didn't know what I knew. And they didn't know who had taught me to wait, to endure, to listen. As the car wound up the final slope, I closed my eyes. I was ready. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but it was the sound that followed, the metallic grind of a bolt turning that stiffened the hairs on my arms. I turned quickly, testing the knob, locked, solid. I was alone, completely. The cabin hadn't changed much, same stone fireplace, same creaky floorboards, but the air, it was off, too still, too staged. A bottle of wine stood waiting on the table, flanked by 2 glasses. Nearby, 3 white candles flickered softly, already lit, and beside them, a stack of cream stationery, the kind I used to write Richard love notes on. A fountain pen rested across the top like a tombstone. My eyes moved slowly across the room. A fire had already been set in the stove, logs arranged just so, kindling tucked beneath like a soldier's bed. It hadn't been lit yet. Then I noticed the faint smell, sweet, metallic. Not smoke, something else. Gas. My lungs tightened as I stepped carefully toward the stove. I didn't touch it, not yet. Instead, I opened the small panel beside it, where Richard had installed the regulator himself. The knob was turned fully open. Celeste's message was clear. The wine, the candles, the pen. It was her twisted farewell gift. I was meant to drink, to write, to let the flames swallow me. A quiet, dignified end, wrapped in romance and soaked in silence. But there's something they never understood about me. I don't panic. I don't scream. I move. I took a long breath and crossed the room to the bookcase. Richard had built it himself, oak, uneven, one shelf deeper than the others. I pressed hard against its side, and it groaned, just as I remembered. Behind the case, tucked in a groove of wood, was a faded leather tube, the old plans of the cabin. Richard kept everything, especially the original schematics of this retreat he'd designed when we thought peace could be built with our own hands. I rolled it out across the desk, weighing the corners down with whatever I could find, an old compass, a cracked paperweight, a brass lighter. My eyes scanned the pencil lines until I saw it, the ventilation shaft above the stove, originally designed to release heat during power outages, and if I was right, it would still connect to the attic crawlspace. I turned back to the fireplace. The flames hadn't caught yet, but I knew they would soon. And once the heat met the gas, there wouldn't be time to think. I grabbed the old rug from beneath the desk and jammed it under the door to slow the draft. Then I climbed onto the stove's brick base, pressing my hands to the wall above it. The metal vent cover was rusted, but not fused. I pried it loose with the edge of a candle holder, coughing as the gas thickened behind me. Inside was tight, barely a foot of crawl space, but I was thin and I was stubborn. I shoved the folder from Marvin into my shirt, tied my scarf around my mouth, and pushed myself upward. It was like crawling through a memory, dark, dusty, lined with the echoes of things unsaid. The shaft turned sharply, then again, then opened into a narrow stretch just below the rafters. I could hear the wind outside, faint and cold through the wood. I inched toward it, my hand scraping against old nails and splinters, until I found the vent to the outer gable. It was small but wide enough. I braced my back, kicked once, twice. The wood cracked. On the third push, it gave way. Fresh air rushed in, and I dragged myself forward until I tumbled onto the porch roof, aching, covered in soot, but alive. Below, the forest stretched out like a witness. I lay there, silent, listening for movement. But there was nothing. They'd locked me in, lit the stove, and left, confident I wouldn't question my fate. I sat up, cradling the folder under my coat, and watched the thin plume of smoke begin to rise from the chimney. They thought I would burn. They thought I would leave quietly, tidily, without mess or memory, but the fire they lit didn't consume me. It lit something else entirely. The smoke curled around the edges of the cabin like memory itself, soft, invasive, impossible to stop. Even as I crawled through the crawl space toward the attic vent, my mind betrayed me. It wasn't panic that came. It was a memory, sharp, unwelcome, but whole. Gregory was 14 the first time I met him. Richard had warned me he'd be difficult. He's smart, he'd said, and angry. But he'll come around. He just needs time to see who you really are. I remembered standing in the sunroom that day, holding a tray of lemon bars I'd baked myself, my hands trembling behind the plate. Gregory had sat at the edge of the couch, arms crossed like he was guarding some ancient treasure. His eyes didn't meet mine. He just muttered, "She's not my mom." He wasn't wrong. I wasn't. But I also wasn't trying to be. "I'm not here to replace anyone," I'd said softly, kneeling to his level. "I'm just here to be here." However that looks, he hadn't answered. But he'd taken a bar. That tiny act, one bite, had felt like a treaty. Years passed. We grew into each other, awkwardly, unevenly. I attended his debates, his first school art exhibit, even the parent-teacher meetings when his mother was too busy to come. I helped him choose a college, reminded him to floss before prom, and left lights on for him when he forgot his key. And yet, I was always still Willa. Never Mom. Not even stepmom. Just Willa. Still, Richard believed in him. "He'll understand one day," he'd say, watching Gregory pull away again after a dinner argument. "He'll see the way you've held this family together." Blood or not, but he never did. Or if he did, it didn't matter in the end. I remember the last time we spoke as something other than enemies. It was 2 years before Richard died. Gregory had just visited the hospital, brought flowers, smiled for photos, but his eyes kept flicking to the machines, calculating. Later, in the hallway, I'd touched his arm. "Whatever's coming," I whispered, "please remember, love isn't a ledger." He'd looked at me for a beat. Then he said, "Everything's a ledger, Willa. Some debts just haven't come due yet." Now here I was, climbing through a space smaller than the lies they told, smoke thickening beneath me. Gregory had grown into his anger, fed it like a flame, and it had burned away any trace of that 14-year-old boy who once bit into a lemon bar in silence. I coughed, my throat raw. The scarf I'd tied around my face was doing little now. My arms shook from the crawl, and my legs were cramping in the narrow space. But I pushed forward, inch by inch, memory by memory. The attic vent was just ahead. I could see faint light pressing through the slats, flickering as smoke danced outside the chimney. I reached it and paused, gasping into my arm, my lungs screaming for clean air. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to scream his name into the rafters and ask, why? Why wasn't it enough that I stood by him? that I buried his father with dignity, that I never once tried to erase his place in this family, but I knew better. Grief doesn't make saints. It makes scavengers. And some children only grow up enough to wear adult clothes, not enough to carry adult truths. I looked down at my hands, blistered, scraped. I could feel the weight of the folder still tucked under my shirt, the statement of intentions Marvin spoke of, the real legacy Richard meant to leave, not just in dollars, but in decisions. I couldn't die here, not because of fear, but because truth, real truth, needs a witness. That was still me, even if they'd erased my title, even if they'd sealed my name out of the will, even if they'd hoped I'd burn. I wasn't done. Not with this story, and certainly not with them. I tore the sheet from the bed with hands that could barely grip. My fingertips burned, my palms raw. I could taste the smoke in my teeth, feel it settle inside my lungs like sediment that would never leave. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Not while the air outside still held the promise of another morning. The vent shaft above me was narrow, covered in decades of dust and cobwebs, but it was my only way out. The fire had spread faster than I thought. The gas lines were old, and the heat from the flames below licked up through the slats of the cabin floor like a warning, or an invitation. I dipped the sheet into the pail of rainwater I'd found behind the pantry, soaking it through. My fingers trembled as I wrapped it around my face and neck, then tied the corners tight behind my head. Next came the mop, one of those old wooden ones Richard used to insist on keeping around. I broke the handle off clean, tested its strength, then used the last of the attic rope to secure the wet sheet around its head. If I could wedge the mop into the first foothold, I might have a chance to climb. I threw the soaked mop up into the shaft, waited until I heard it catch against the upper rung, and tugged. It held. "Please," I whispered to the wood, the metal, to my body, to God. I didn't know who was listening anymore. I pulled myself up, inch by inch, toes scrabbling for grip. The heat rose fast now. The fire beneath me wasn't waiting. I felt it in my thighs, my knees, the blistered tips of my fingers. At one point, my boot slipped, and I slammed against the sidewall of the shaft. I didn't scream, not because I was brave, but because I had no air left to give. When I reached the top, I had to twist my shoulders sideways to fit through the final narrow gap. The rusted vent cover gave way with a groan, and morning light stabbed my eyes. For a moment, I lay there on the roof, half in, half out, like a creature reborn through a wound in the world. The sun had just risen, streaking the sky with soft pinks and fading indigos. The forest beyond the clearing was still quiet, dew-covered, unaware. I rolled over onto the gravel shingles, the coolness biting into my burns. My right palm was blistered open, the skin torn where I'd grabbed the sharp metal edges. My left arm had dark streaks where smoke had seared through my sleeve. But I was out, alive. No sirens, no footsteps, just me and the distant sound of birds. I stayed low, crawling along the ridgeline of the cabin roof until I could drop down into the tall brush behind the woodshed. My knees buckled when I hit the ground, but I bit down on my tongue to keep from crying out. They couldn't know. Not yet. I made my way toward the tree line, using fallen branches to cover my footprints as best I could. The woods were thick and familiar. Richard had loved this land, mapped every inch of it like it was sacred. I remembered his journals, the ones he'd filled with roots and sketches. I remembered the trail that cut east, toward the edge of the old ranger station. I could make it there before midday, if my legs held. Hours passed. My clothes dried with the smoke still clinging to them. I drank from the stream near the ridge, cleaned my wounds with leaves and bark as best I could. My breath slowed eventually, but the ache in my chest wasn't just physical. I had loved them. I had loved them like they were mine, and they had tried to burn me alive. By the time I reached the old station, my feet were bleeding. I slipped inside through the broken back door and found an old landline still intact. No signal, but a dial tone. God bless those forgotten wires. I called Walter first. He answered after one ring. "Willa!" His voice cracked. "Is it really you?" "I'm alive," I whispered. "Don't say anything to anyone. Just wait." There was a beat of silence. Then, "She posted a tribute, said you passed away peacefully. Gregory said they found your scarf and the wine bottle and ashes." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. He added quietly, "I never believed it." I smiled, tears stinging my smoke-stained cheeks. "I need your help." Just once more, he agreed without hesitation. Later that night, once I found shelter in a safe place I won't name here, I finally connected to the internet. I saw the posts. "Rest in peace to the matriarch who gave so much. Willa Mayford's legacy lives on through our stewardship." There were photos, a candle-lit cabin, a framed portrait from years ago. Celeste even had the audacity to pose in black, hands folded, eyes downcast, like grief wore designer shoes. Gregory smiled in every shot, thin, controlled, like the world had just been handed to him, and he was trying not to laugh. I studied them. Every line, every false memory they were manufacturing. Let them believe I was gone. Let them post and preen and pour champagne. Because in the silence of their celebration, I was already writing the end. I borrowed a church coat from the shelter and pinned up my hair in a way no one had seen in years. A pair of tinted glasses completed the look, not quite disguise, just enough to make someone hesitate before they said, "Aren't you?" The nursing home was tucked behind a chain pharmacy in a quiet part of town, a place where forgotten people waited out their afternoons under low ceilings and soft music. I signed in as Margaret Doyle, niece of Mr. Marvin Heller. The receptionist didn't ask for ID. She glanced at the schedule, saw a blank slot next to his name, and buzzed me through. Marvin was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, watching a squirrel fight with a blue jay over a slice of sandwich crust. His hair was thinner than I remembered. His sweater hung looser. But when he turned to look at me, his eyes were exactly the same, sharp, patient, and already knowing. "I wondered how long it would take," he said. "I had to make sure no one followed me," I whispered, sitting beside him. "They think I'm dead." His smile flickered. "Good. Let's keep it that way a little longer." The room smelled of antiseptic and artificial lilacs. Somewhere down the hall, someone coughed, and a nurse laughed too loudly. Marvin's hand trembled as he reached into the blanket across his lap and pulled out a small metal tin, shaped like an old candy box. He placed it gently in my palm. "Don't open it here," he said. "They check trash. But what's inside will change everything." I could feel the weight of it. Not heavy, but solid. Purposeful. I looked at him. "Is it what you hinted at?" I asked. He nodded. "It's the original statement of intentions. Signed and dated. Richard insisted on it. He knew Gregory would try something, though I doubt even he imagined the cruelty they'd sink to." My throat clenched. "And the audio?" Marvin blinked slowly, as if deciding how much pain to spare me. He recorded a few personal messages. "One of them mentions you directly. I saved that clip to the drive, just in case." We sat in silence for a moment. The sun fell in long beams across the tiled floor. I studied the lines in Marvin's face and thought about the years he had spent cleaning up after other people's messes. "They threatened you, didn't they?" I asked. He didn't answer directly, just said, "I retired earlier than planned." That's all the story anyone needs. I slipped the tin into the inside pocket of my coat, where it rested against my ribs like a second heartbeat. "Marvin, if anything happens to me—" "Don't say it," he cut in, voice suddenly firm. "You've come this far. You survived what they did. You do not speak like someone about to lose." I looked down at my hands. The burns were healing slowly, red and taut across my knuckles, but they reminded me of what silence had cost, of how long I'd let myself believe I was just a bystander to my own life. "I need a name," I said quietly. "Someone I can trust to make this legal. Fast, before they figure out I'm alive." He didn't hesitate. "Judge Holloway." She was a friend of Richard's, old school but clean. "I'll send her word to expect you, privately. Use her mountain home address. Not the courthouse." I nodded. Wrote the name down in the corner of a crossword puzzle I folded into my purse. Then Marvin leaned in, eyes steady. "Willa, I want you to listen to the audio yourself, not just for evidence, but because you need to remember who he believed you were." I left before lunch hour. Outside, the wind carried a dry chill. I walked several blocks before I called Walter from a payphone. "I have it," I told him. He didn't ask how or where, just said, "Good." "What next?" "I'm going to disappear." "For now. But I need you to hold on to the envelope I left in your backpack." "The green one?" "Yes. Inside is the secondary backup of everything. If you don't hear from me in 3 days, you mail it, exactly as we planned." He went quiet for a second. Then, "I won't let anything happen to it." Or to you, I almost told him thank you. Almost told him I was proud of him. But the words caught somewhere behind my tongue, too big and too soft to push past. Instead, I said, "You'll know when the time is right." I found a corner diner off the highway, paid in cash for a booth by the back. The waitress poured coffee without looking at me. I waited until she disappeared, then pulled out the tin. Inside was a flash drive, wrapped in gauze and tucked into a medicine bottle. I plugged it into a cheap burner laptop I'd picked up that morning. It loaded slowly, then clicked open. There he was, Richard's voice. Softer than I remembered, but steady. "If someone tries to isolate Willa, to harm her, to erase her, then they don't deserve a cent from me. She is the keeper of my life." The one I chose, I closed the laptop, pressed my fingers to my lips. I had what I needed. Now it was time to make them remember who I was. The doors to the East Conservatory opened at exactly 4 o'clock. I stood just beyond the archway for a moment, letting the sound of soft piano and clinking glasses wash over me. The kind of music they always played at fundraisers and charity galas, soulless, polished, and expensive. Gregory's voice echoed across the room, mid-toast. To a woman we all admired, her warmth, her wisdom, her quiet presence that will be deeply missed. They raised glasses. Champagne, of course. Crystal flutes glinting under chandeliers. I stepped forward. My heels touched the marble with deliberate weight. I wore a plain black dress, hem just below the knee. My hair, once long and swept into soft buns, was cropped close now, clean, stark. My face was bare, no makeup, no jewelry, nothing soft left to offer. At first, no one noticed. The room was too full of staged grief and greedy smiles. Then Walter turned. He had been sitting by the ivy-covered windows, quiet, hands folded, watching everything with the wary stillness only a child like him could master. He saw me. He didn't gasp, didn't call out. He stood up, slowly, deliberately, and he clapped. Once, then twice. The sound cracked through the room like a starter's pistol. All movement froze. Eyes turned. Forks paused mid-air. I met Gregory's gaze across the sea of confusion. He went pale. His champagne glass trembled. Celeste, standing beside him in a pearl gray dress, let her smile falter just a second too long before recovering. "Willa," he breathed, almost inaudibly. I said nothing. I walked toward the center of the room where the projection screen behind them still displayed a looping photo montage of Richard, his younger days in Patagonia, his lab, his final months in the garden with me, all curated, all sanitized. I reached the podium and placed both hands on the edge, steady, calm. Gregory cleared his throat. Everyone, this is obviously a moment of confusion. Willa, we didn't know you were coming. We thought, dead? I offered gently. A ripple of unease flickered. Celeste took a step forward. There's no need for drama, Willa. We were simply honoring my disappearance, I interrupted, still soft, but clear enough that even the waiter by the far wall looked up. The silence now was thick, not awkward, not stunned, anticipatory. I opened the folder I'd been carrying under one arm and held up a single sheet. The statement of intentions, signed, dated, backed by audio, notarized in 3 countries. Before Richard passed, I said, he made arrangements that were never meant to be read in public. But given the circumstances, I think we all deserve clarity. Gregory stepped toward me. You can't do this. This isn't the venue. No, I agreed. This isn't a courtroom. Yet his eyes darted to Celeste. She gave a tight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. I scanned the room. Faces ranged from stunned to mortified to suddenly fascinated. People smelled drama, truth, and money. The head of the family's foundation whispered to her assistant. Richard's old business partner slowly lowered his drink. Walter walked to my side and placed a flash drive on the podium. He didn't say a word, just met my eyes and gave a small nod, then returned to his seat. I breathed in. I was locked inside a cabin, I said. It was meant to look like an accident. A farewell. A surrender. It wasn't gasps now, actual ones. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. Gregory was visibly sweating. Celeste's face had gone chalk white. In that moment, I continued, I realized that silence only protects those who harm. Richard once told me, if I ever had to choose between staying quiet or telling the truth, I should do the one that scared me more. I placed the statement face up on the table and turned it toward them. Richard never changed his intentions. I am the sole trustee of the estate. Every condition of the trust hinges on integrity and survival. A few people began to whisper. Phones were being pulled out. Someone was already fact-checking on a legal database, no doubt. Celeste suddenly moved, striding quickly toward me. You're unstable, she hissed under her breath. You've always been unwell. No one's going to believe. A voice rose up from the back. She's telling the truth. It was Marvin, standing just inside the doorway, leaning on a cane, breath labored, but there. She's telling the truth, he repeated, and I have the records to prove it. Everything stopped. The ripple became a wave. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just let the silence work. Let them sit in it. Let them feel what it's like when the woman you tried to erase walks into the room with everything you thought you buried, alive, intact, and unafraid. For the first time in my life, I felt not vengeful, but seen. I wasn't just Willa. I was the storm they never expected. The courtroom smelled of pine polish and old paper. That morning, the sun had split through the tall windows with such precision, it made everything feel staged, like justice had been waiting here longer than any of us. I sat in the witness box with my hands folded in my lap. No dramatic entrance, no gasps. I had already walked back into their world once. Now I would dismantle it, quietly, thoroughly. Gregory sat at the table across from me, flanked by 2 attorneys in tailored gray. His face twitched every time I looked at him. Celeste didn't sit. She paced behind him like a lioness in a glass cage. She'd worn cream silk and too much perfume, as if fabric could protect her. The judge adjusted her glasses. Miss Mayford, let's begin with the most basic question. You are, in fact, alive? I am, I answered. And do you have evidence of intentional harm done to you by the parties listed in this case? I didn't reply with words. I simply nodded toward Marvin, who stood in the back of the courtroom. He held up the USB in his gloved hand and handed it to the clerk. A moment later, the courtroom speakers came alive. Richard's voice, cracked but steady. If anyone tries to silence Willa, to take from her what I've placed in her hands, they forfeit every right to what I've built. She is not only my wife, she is my conscience. A stillness fell over the room like ash, the kind of silence that doesn't settle. It suffocates. I didn't look at Gregory. I didn't need to. I felt the air shift around him. Celeste was the one who broke it. She stood and pointed a trembling hand at the judge. "This is fabricated," she screamed. "This whole performance, this is a setup. Everything is mine. Richard told me so. He told us both, in private." The judge remained stone-faced. "The court requires documented proof of such claims, Mrs. Langford. We had proof. She destroyed it." That was when I spoke again, calm, even. "I didn't destroy anything. I preserved what mattered." Gregory's lawyer finally found his voice. "Your Honor, the statement of intentions was never meant to override the will." "The trust is not governed by the will," I said, turning slightly to address the room. "It's governed by the grantor's intentions. And I am not here to claim inheritance. I am here because Richard made me the controlling trustee, not a beneficiary. A gatekeeper." Celeste's lips parted, confused. "What are you saying?" I turned toward her fully now. "I'm saying you misunderstood everything. I am not the heir. I'm the guardian." A hush fell. I reached into my bag and took out a printed mission charter, stamped and notarized. This trust is being redirected as per Richard's supplemental instructions to a foundation, one that will support senior women, particularly those who've been silenced, displaced, or exploited by their families. The courtroom barely breathed. Celeste blinked, stunned. "You mean you're giving it away?" "No," I said. "I'm protecting it." Gregory's lawyer leaned forward. "That's not legally viable." "Actually," the judge interjected, eyes scanning the document handed to her by the bailiff, "it is. The grantor's language explicitly delegates discretionary authority to the trustee, provided the act falls within the realm of ethical stewardship." Celeste lost whatever composure she had left. "You vindictive witch!" she shrieked. "You think you can steal what was supposed to be ours and give it to strangers?" I stood slowly. "I think," I said, voice low but steady, "you never understood what Richard built. It wasn't for you to host charity galas in his name while you plotted in private. It wasn't for you to siphon off pieces behind closed doors." My gaze held Gregory's then. "And it wasn't for you to inherit by force." Gregory's hands gripped the edge of the table. "This isn't over," he said, barely audible. "You can't humiliate us and walk away clean." "I'm not walking away," I replied. "I'm walking forward." "There's a difference." The judge called for recess. I stepped down from the stand. Walter met me by the exit, his face bright with something he hadn't shown in months. Relief. "You didn't keep it for yourself," he whispered. I looked down at him, gently smoothing his collar. It was never mine to keep, only to protect. And in that moment, I felt it for the first time. Not victory, not vengeance, but peace. It was just past 6 when Walter arrived at the cabin I now stayed in, the one Marvin had helped arrange through an old friend, quiet, tucked behind a ridge of firs. His hands were shaking, and his breath was uneven, like he'd run the whole way from town. "He followed me," he said. "I lost him, I think, but I'm not sure." I guided him inside without another word and pulled the curtain shut. He sat on the worn love seat, the same one Richard and I had once hauled up from the lake house after a storm. The cushion sagged under his weight. The boy looked smaller than usual. "Gregory?" I asked. Walter nodded. "He cornered me outside the school parking lot, said he just wanted to talk man to man. Asked where the flash drive was. Told me you were confused, that it wasn't real, that the lawyers were going to make a mess of everything, and if I helped him, he could help me. College, internships, travel. My jaw tightened. Gregory's desperation was showing. He'd seen the court's reaction. He knew the tide had turned, and now he was clawing for loose ends. "What did you say to him?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Walter had never lied to me. "I said I didn't know where it was," he whispered, which technically wasn't a lie, because I didn't have it. You already gave it to someone else, right? I reached into the wooden drawer beside the chair and pulled out a printed slip of confirmation. Walter read it carefully, eyes darting across the signature, the timestamp, the receiving law firm. "I sent the original to a third-party attorney out of state 2 days ago," I said. "They hold the master file and the statement of intentions sealed under full legal protection." Walter let out a shaky exhale and leaned back. "So, even if they'd gotten this one, it wouldn't matter," I finished for him. He looked up at me, a question in his eyes I'd seen once in Richard's too, when a younger man didn't know whether he was still a boy. "Am I in trouble?" he asked softly. I knelt down in front of him. "No, Walter. You're the reason this file still exists. You fixed the typewriter when no one else cared. You remembered the number. You made the first map to truth without even knowing it." He blinked fast. "I didn't mean to get involved. I just wanted to help you. You were the only one who didn't treat me like an accessory to someone else's name." A silence passed between us. I touched his hand. "Let me tell you something that Gregory never learned. Possessions can be stolen, but memory that lives where no lawyer or thief can reach. Your mind is your fortress, your recall, your integrity, your choice to protect. It matters." He bit his lower lip. "What if they try again?" "They will," I said simply, "but next time they'll find a woman who is no longer afraid, and a boy who is no longer alone." I walked him out just before dark, through the narrow path behind the ridge that led back toward the main road. The air was cooling quickly, and the autumn leaves rustled with secrets of their own. Before he stepped past the tree line, he turned and asked, "Do they really think this is about money?" I smiled. "People like them always do." He smiled back, then disappeared into the trees, careful with every step. Back inside, I stood by the fireplace, holding the now empty drive in my hand, not a symbol of power, but of protection. It was never about the data. It was about the principle, about proving that no matter how carefully they plotted, no matter how silently they moved, I had moved first. Quiet doesn't mean weak, and trust, real trust, isn't stored on paper. It's stored in the choices we make when no one's watching. The courtroom was quiet when the judge returned. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for attention. It simply expected it. Celeste sat 2 rows ahead of me, arms folded tightly across her chest. Gregory was beside her, tapping his left foot so hard the oak floor hummed beneath it. Their lawyer leaned forward, lips pressed into a line that said more than any defense brief ever could. I didn't lean. I didn't fold. I simply breathed. "All parties rise," the bailiff called. We stood. The judge's robe trailed as she took her seat. She glanced at the stack of papers before her, then at the gallery, then at us. "After careful review of the evidence presented," she began, "this court finds the contested will dated March 17th to be invalid. The document in question contains inconsistencies in signature verification, witness accounts, and procedural compliance." Gregory blinked. Celeste's chin tilted up, almost in defiance, but her knuckles were white around her purse. Further, the statement of intentions, authenticated and signed directly by the late Mr. Richard Mayford, has been verified by independent forensic review. In light of this, the claim of sole inheritance by Mr. Gregory Mayford is dismissed. There it was. No gasps, no outbursts, just truth laid bare, like a beam of morning light cracking across a floor long kept in shadow. The judge wasn't done. This court is also forwarding material to the district attorney's office concerning potential criminal intent, specifically allegations of attempted endangerment of Ms. Willa Mayford and the use of falsified documents to obstruct estate proceedings. I felt Gregory's eyes shift toward me. They were no longer full of superiority, only disbelief. Celeste gripped his arm, but he didn't move. A faint murmur rippled through the back rows of the courtroom, but the judge held up one hand, quieting it. "Let me be clear," she said. "We are not here to mediate family grudges. We are here to uphold the law, and the law, in this case, has spoken." She nodded once. "Court is adjourned." The gavel didn't echo. It landed softly, deliberately, the way truth does when it doesn't need to shout. As people filed out, I remained in my seat. I watched Celeste try to whisper something to Gregory, but he didn't answer. He didn't look at her. He just stood there, frozen, like a man who'd mistaken the ending for a victory, and was only now realizing he'd never known the rules of the game. Their lawyer didn't say a word. He just gathered his things and left them there. Walter was waiting by the hallway in his school blazer, a quiet presence like always. I joined him, and we walked slowly toward the glass doors. "How do you feel?" he asked. I paused. "Not triumphant," I said. "Just free." He nodded, as though he understood more than his 17 years should allow. At the base of the courthouse steps, reporters waited with cameras, microphones, questions I'd never entertain. They called my name. I didn't answer. I had no interest in turning their cruelty into theater. Some stories aren't meant to be performed. Some are just meant to end, so healing can begin. One of the cameramen followed us for a while before giving up. Walter and I continued down the sidewalk until the courthouse disappeared behind us, replaced by rows of autumn-stripped trees. "Will they go to prison?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "That's no longer my concern." He looked surprised. "But they tried to." "I know," I said. "But punishment doesn't interest me, Walter. Survival did. And now? Legacy does." He fell silent, walking beside me with a sort of reverence, like the earth itself had shifted. As we crossed the street and reached the quiet corner where my car waited, I took one final look back. Not at the courthouse, but at the girl I had been before Richard died, the one who thought trust could be inherited. It cannot. It must be earned, protected, fought for. And when it's shattered, it must be rebuilt, not in noise, but in silence, not with fury, but with clarity. I had not returned to win. I had returned to witness, to stand firm, to let them see that what they tried to erase had endured anyway. And that was enough. I signed the deed on a Tuesday morning, with little ceremony, no photographers, no congratulations, just a pen, a page, and the steady rhythm of my breath as I wrote my name one more time, where others had tried to erase it. The cabin was mine again, not the trap it had been, not the mausoleum Gregory and Celeste had tried to turn it into, but a place reborn. The first time I drove up the mountain road with the keys in my pocket, the trees whispered a different song. The air smelled cleaner, as though even nature had decided to forgive the smoke. I stopped at the gate and sat for a moment, listening to the crunch of gravel under the tires, and felt the kind of silence that heals instead of harms. The cabin had been charred beyond comfort, but not beyond redemption. Its bones were still strong. I had walked away from its ashes once before, but this time I chose to walk back, not for nostalgia, for purpose. Richard had always said walls were only as meaningful as the lives they sheltered. I decided this place would shelter more than memories. It would shelter women who had been told, as I had, that their years made them weak, that their silence was permanent, that betrayal was their final chapter. I named it Haven Rest, though I rarely spoke the name aloud. It wasn't about branding. It was about belonging. The renovations took months. I kept the log exterior, darker now, scarred in places where the fire had licked too deeply, but I left those scars visible. Women who came here would recognize themselves in the wood, damaged but not destroyed. Inside, I opened the rooms, stripped away the oppressive decor Gregory had ordered, and returned them to something simpler. Hand-woven quilts covered the beds. Shelves held journals, not sculptures. There was a circle of armchairs around a stone hearth where laughter could echo again. I had lavender planted along the porch, not because it masked the smell of smoke, but because it insisted that peace could grow where pain once lived. I could not do it alone. That was when Delilah arrived. She was 63, a retired secretary with nimble hands and a sharp wit. We met at a small repair shop downtown when I brought in my old typewriter, the one Richard had once used to draft speeches about energy and justice. Its keys were stiff, warped from years of disuse, and most would have told me to throw it away, but Delilah ran her fingers over it like a pianist meeting an old instrument. "Not broken," she said, "just tired." I laughed for the first time in weeks. "Aren't we all?" She came to Haven Rest soon after, first to deliver the typewriter, later to stay. It was her idea to build a workshop in the back room where women could fix small machines, lamps, radios, even sewing tables. "When you repair something with your hands," she told me, "you remember you are not disposable either." I asked her to be the manager of Haven Rest. She never answered directly, but she never left either. That was enough. The first women arrived quietly, referred by a church counselor, a community worker, a friend of a friend. Each one carried the weight of betrayal, visible not in their posture, but in their eyes. Some had been pushed out of homes they paid for. Some had been declared incompetent by children eager for control. Some had simply been left behind, their loyalty spent like pocket change. They came to the cabin with little more than bags of clothing, and I welcomed them with tea and silence. No probing questions, just a room of their own, a lock they could trust, and the assurance that here, their story would not be dismissed. I became less of a matriarch and more of a gardener. I watered, I tended, I gave space. I watched as they relearned how to sleep without fear, how to sit in a chair without bracing for accusation, how to breathe without apology. Delilah organized evening readings by the fire. Sometimes they read poetry, sometimes letters they had never mailed. Often the words dissolved into tears, but even tears felt like reclamation. I would sit in my chair, Richard's watch still on my wrist, and think, this is the legacy he never imagined but would have blessed. Walter visited every month. He was taller each time, his voice settling deeper into manhood. He would drive up in his second-hand car, park crookedly by the gate, and come bounding in with boxes of pastries or spare parts for Delilah's workshop. The women adored him. He carried their groceries, fixed their radios, listened when they needed a young ear that wasn't hardened by cynicism. I saw in him what Richard had always hoped Gregory would become, a man who understood strength as service. One evening, after dinner, Walter asked me if I thought Gregory would ever change. I looked into the fire before answering. "Change is possible for those who admit the truth," I said, "but some would rather burn than bend." I did not waste energy on Gregory or Celeste anymore. The law had taken its course. The trust was intact, not as their possession, but as a living resource. Funds flowed into Haven Rest discreetly, enough to maintain the house, pay for food, and cover small stipends for the women who stayed. I made sure no one felt like a guest. Everyone contributed. Some cooked, some gardened, some wrote grant letters. Some simply told their stories so others could heal by hearing them. I had discovered that dignity is contagious when nurtured. Nights at Haven Rest were different than nights in the old cabin. Once, silence here had suffocated me. Now, it soothed. The wind in the pines became a lullaby. the creak of floorboards a reminder that life still moved. I would often sit at my desk with the repaired typewriter, its keys tapping under my fingers, writing letters not to the dead but to the living, to the women whose names I did not yet know, who would someday walk through our doors. I would tell them, "You are not forgotten. You are not finished. This cabin is waiting for you." As the seasons turned, the house filled with more laughter. The lavender blossomed in purple waves. The porch echoed with knitting needles clicking, teacups clinking, stories weaving together. Walter brought his friends one summer to help repair the roof, and they left graffiti under the shingles. Strength lives here. I didn't paint over it. Some truths should remain hidden in plain sight. Standing at the porch rail one evening, I thought of Richard. I thought of his belief that true wealth wasn't in numbers, but in what remained standing after loss. I smiled then, realizing that the cabin, scarred and rebuilt, was his prophecy fulfilled. What remained standing wasn't just wood and stone. It was us, women who had been told they were finished, now beginning again. I didn't reclaim the cabin to prove Gregory or Celeste wrong. I reclaimed it to prove every woman right who had ever whispered, "I deserve better." Haven Rest was not about revenge, it was about resurrection, and every time a new guest arrived with eyes heavy from betrayal, I would hand them a key and say the same simple words, "You are safe now. You are seen." And in their faces, I saw myself, reborn, not by fire, but by choice. It was late afternoon when the knock came. The lavender outside the porch stirred in the wind, and the sound of it mixed with the gentle tapping at the door. I wiped my hands on the apron Delilah insisted I wear while helping in the kitchen, and I walked slowly across the wooden floor. For a moment, I thought it would be Walter again, bounding in with boxes of pastries and a grin too wide for his face. But when I opened the door, I found 3 women standing together, their shoulders hunched against a fear that wasn't the weather. The first was tall, her hair braided neatly but her eyes darting as if expecting someone to push her back down the path. The second was smaller, clutching a paper bag to her chest like it contained her entire life. The third, the one who spoke, trembled so much she could hardly hold her purse strap steady. Her voice cracked with the question she carried like a stone. Do we need to pay something to stay?" Her words were heavy with shame, as though she had been taught that safety was a commodity always out of her reach. I stepped back, opening the door wide, and smiled the way Richard once taught me, soft, steady, without pity. "Do you have a good memory?" I asked gently. The women looked confused. "Because if you do," I continued, "I'll need help labeling files in the study. That's the only payment I ask for the first time." The trembling woman let out a breath that sounded like the release of years. She nodded quickly, tears brightening her eyes, and clutched my hand as if it were a lifeline. I guided them inside, where the fire burned low and Delilah had just set a kettle on the stove. The cabin had a way of absorbing pain. The women sat stiffly at first, perched on the edges of chairs, as though afraid they would be told to leave. I poured tea into mismatched cups and placed them gently in their hands. "You are not guests here," I said. "You are part of the house now, and the house knows how to keep secrets safe." Delilah joined me, bustling about with a dish of honey and fresh bread. She winked at them, her warmth filling the corners where my quiet couldn't reach. They began to speak in fragments. The tall woman, whose name was Esther, whispered about her son selling her house while she was still living in it. The smaller one, Marjorie, had been signed into a nursing home against her will, her daughter pocketing the pension. The trembling one, Ruth Ann, confessed that her nephew had forged her name on documents she never saw. Each story was another echo of my own. Betrayal wears many disguises, but it always leaves the same wound, being told you no longer matter. I listened, my hands folded, my breath steady. I didn't interrupt. I let their words spill until the silence between them felt softer, less raw. Then I said, "You are not here because you were weak. You are here because you survived, and survival is the beginning of strength." They looked at me as if I had handed them something tangible, something they could carry in their pockets when the nights grew long. Delilah showed them the rooms we had prepared: simple beds, quilts sewn by volunteers, shelves with journals waiting for their words. As I watched them trail behind her, I remembered the night I walked out of the woods covered in ash, my lungs torn with smoke. I had asked myself then what my survival meant. Now I knew. It meant I could be here to open this door for them. Later that evening, after supper, we gathered by the hearth. Esther sat quietly staring into the flames, her lips moving as though in prayer. Marjorie hummed an old hymn under her breath while mending a button on her blouse. Ruth Ann asked shyly if she could help with the files in the study tomorrow, remembering the promise I had given her at the door. I smiled, touched her hand, and said, "Yes, the labels are waiting for you." She laughed nervously, but it was laughter nonetheless, fragile but real. Walter arrived just before nightfall, carrying a box of notebooks and pens he had bought with his part-time job money. When he saw the new women, he introduced himself without hesitation, shaking their hands with the grace of someone twice his age. They looked at him with wonder, perhaps expecting a young man to dismiss them, but he treated them as equals. I watched him from my chair and felt pride swell in my chest. In him, I saw a bridge between generations, proof that not all youth were poisoned by greed. As the fire settled into embers, I spoke softly, not to command, but to anchor. This cabin is not about forgetting what was done to us. It is about remembering that what was done does not define who we are. Here we begin again, each of us, in silence if we need, in laughter if we can. The women nodded, their eyes glistening, their hands trembling less. The house seemed to exhale with us, its walls no longer echoing with betrayal but with belonging. That night, I walked through the hall, listening to the creak of floorboards and the quiet murmur of new voices settling in. The cabin was alive again, not with fire but with healing. At the end of the corridor, I paused by Richard's old photograph, framed and hung above the desk. I touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "This is what your trust was for, Richard. Not for wealth to be hoarded, but for dignity to be restored." His eyes, forever frozen in that gentle smile, seemed to agree. When I returned to my room, I heard faint laughter from Esther's door, the first sound of joy she had allowed herself in years. I lay down, the scent of lavender drifting through the window, and felt the weight of the day lift. I had been locked in fire once, betrayed by those who should have protected me. But tonight, the knock on the door reminded me of something simple and profound. Survival is never just for oneself. It is a gift meant to be shared. And so, when morning came, with sunlight spilling across the porch, I was ready. Ready for more knocks, ready for more stories, ready to answer them all with the same steady words. You are safe. Here. You are seen. And you are home. I wasn't there when Walter sat in front of the admissions committee, but I imagined him clearly. Buttoned-up shirt, hair combed back, his left foot tapping slightly beneath the table, like it always did when he was nervous. I imagined the panel asking him about leadership or resilience, or some other word adults like to use, when testing whether a young man understood the weight of his own story. And I imagined him pausing before answering. He later told me that the room was so quiet, he could hear the tick of the wall clock above them. 3 professors, 1 counselor, and an empty chair between them all, likely left there for symmetry. Walter said he looked at that chair and thought of me. "I'd like to talk about someone most people overlook," he began. The counselor tilted her head. One of the professors adjusted his glasses. Walter straightened in his seat. She wasn't famous. She didn't win awards. She didn't run a business. But she rebuilt a life out of ash. Literally, they listened. She was my step-grandmother. But calling her that doesn't feel right. She was more. Her name is Willa Mayford. He told them how he used to believe all the worst things whispered about me, that I was the reason his grandfather grew distant, that I was cold, calculating, and not to be trusted. He told them about the stories Celeste repeated over dinner, about how I'd seduced my way into the family, about how I'd tried to take what was never mine. And then, Walter said, his voice cracked just slightly when he told them the moment it all changed. She called me once just to ask how school was going. She didn't try to defend herself. She didn't explain or beg. She just said, "I hear you've been reading a lot of Baldwin lately." That's good. Read people who make you uncomfortable. They teach you things. Walter said he remembered hanging up and staring at the ceiling for a long time. He started to wonder what kind of villain took the time to talk about books, what kind of fraud asked if he was eating well. He told the panel about the night everything came undone, how my so-called death became a family announcement party, and how, when I walked into that room alive, everything in his world shifted. Not because of the shock, but because I didn't yell. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't even claim a single penny for myself. She didn't win the argument, Walter said. She reclaimed dignity. For herself, yes, but also for me, for every person who sat at that table and had to face the version of themselves they'd allowed to exist. He spoke of the cabin now turned refuge, of the women who came there carrying broken pasts and quiet courage, of how he visited every month and helped with repairs, gardening, and sometimes just listening. He said that being there made him realize what real strength looked like. She taught me that silence isn't weakness. It's power, when you choose it. And forgiveness, it isn't forgetting. It's remembering fully and choosing peace anyway. Walter told me later that one of the professors wiped his eyes when he said that. In the final part of his answer, he leaned forward, placed his hands on the table, and said, "I want to study ethics and social systems because I've seen what happens when power isn't questioned, and I've seen what one woman can do without a title or spotlight, just by staying true to what's right." She gave me that. She gave me the blueprint. That night, he came to the cabin with a small envelope in his hand. I was folding linens by the window when he held it out, his grin stretching wider than I'd ever seen it. Inside was the acceptance letter with a handwritten note at the bottom from one of the panelists. "You're the kind of man who restores faith." I asked him how the interview went, and he just laughed, collapsing onto the porch bench beside me. "I think I broke their expectations," he said. "Good," I replied. "Let them stay broken." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a new notebook, flipping it open. "I want to write it down. All of it. The whole story. From your side, too, I didn't answer right away. I just kept folding, corner to corner, soft cotton to soft cotton, and then I said, 'Start with the fire.' Not the one that tried to end me, the one I lit when I chose to stay alive." He scribbled that down without hesitation, and as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the porch, I realized something I hadn't before. My story was no longer mine alone. It had traveled. It had grown legs and wings, and now it would walk into lecture halls and libraries and late-night debates on justice and truth. And when they asked Walter where he learned what mattered most, I knew he'd say, "From a woman who didn't try to win. She just made sure we remembered who we are." I sat back watching him write, the quiet clicking of his pen filling the space between us. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the ending I had never been given had finally begun. I was sitting on the porch, hands wrapped around a chipped blue mug of coffee, the kind Delilah insisted was too old to use. The cabin had changed. New floors, open windows, laughter from women down the hall folding laundry and humming Ella Fitzgerald. The air smelled like lavender and cut wood. Then I saw the car. It parked just outside the tree line, black, clean. A rental, maybe. For a moment, no one stepped out. I thought perhaps they'd changed their mind, that it was someone lost, but then the door opened, and there she was. Celeste. She stood by the driver's side, her hand gripping the door as if it anchored her. She didn't move for a full minute, just stood there, taking in the cabin, the garden, the sign that read, House of Quiet Return. Her eyes lingered on the wind chimes I'd hung by, the porch. They were made from the old brass pipes Walter found behind the shed. They sang gently in the breeze, like they were the only ones brave enough to speak. I didn't get up. She walked toward me slowly, her boots crunching on gravel. She wore a tan coat. Her hair was shorter, neat, but her face carried the same hardness I'd seen the day she poured that wine and set the stage. She didn't speak, and I didn't offer words. She reached the bottom step of the porch and stopped. Just stood there, one foot on the first board. I could see her chest rise and fall, no tears, no apology, just presence. I set my mug down beside me and reached for the envelope I'd placed on the small wooden table weeks ago. It had waited there like a silent guest, patient and unopened. I held it out toward her, my hand steady. She stared at it. Her lips pressed together, then relaxed. She climbed the 2 steps and took it from me. The envelope was thick. Inside was a printed copy of the original cabin plan, the renovation permits, the staff handbook Delilah helped me write, and a hand-drawn sketch Walter made of the dorm rooms we hoped to build in the fall. Celeste didn't open it. She just held it, both hands wrapped around the paper like it might burn through her skin. I looked her in the eyes. If you still know what redemption looks like, don't talk. Just do. Her gaze didn't waver, but I saw the shift. The fingers of her left hand trembled slightly, almost imperceptibly. Not from cold. The wind had died down. It was quiet now, the kind of quiet that holds weight, not absence. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock inside, the creak of Delilah's steps upstairs, and Celeste's breath. She didn't argue, didn't spit out some bitter defense or launch into justifications. She turned, walked back the way she came. Her shoulders weren't squared like I remembered. They sagged, only slightly, but enough to know something inside her had collapsed and hadn't yet been rebuilt. As she reached her car, she paused. Her hand hovered over the door handle. She didn't look back, but she opened the passenger door, leaned in, and came out with something in her hand, a single red lily. She walked back to the porch, her steps faster now, as if afraid her own courage might dissolve. She placed the flower gently on the wooden step, just beside my mug. Then she left. No words, no gestures. But the envelope was still in her hand, gripped like a second chance. After the sound of the engine faded, I sat there for a long time, unmoving. The red lily lay by my feet, vibrant against the dull grain of the porch. Delilah came out 10 minutes later. She looked at the spot where the flower was, looked at me, didn't ask. I said, "She came." Delilah nodded once. "And?" "I don't know yet," I said, but her hand was shaking. We didn't speak of it again. But that evening, when I walked into the office to turn off the lights, I saw something new taped to the bulletin board. Celeste's name, scribbled at the bottom of a volunteer sign-up sheet for our fall building project. It wasn't in her handwriting. Not exactly. But it had her hesitation in every letter. And that was enough for now. The envelope arrived on a Monday morning. Plain cream, no return address, the edges slightly worn like it had waited a long time to be opened. Delilah handed it to me during breakfast. Her brow furrowed, but she didn't ask questions. She knew by now that some things needed silence more than answers. I held it in my lap for a while, fingers tracing the texture of the paper. It smelled faintly of cedar and old ink. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. James Harrelson, one of Richard's oldest friends, a man who hadn't spoken to me since Richard passed, until now. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear. Inside was a folded letter, the ink faded but still legible, and a note from James. He gave this to me the week before the surgery. Said I'd know when to send it. I hope now is the right time, my breath caught. I unfolded the letter, and there it was, Richard's handwriting. That looping, deliberate script that used to fill the margins of cookbooks and grocery lists. My name at the top, and beneath it, his words. Willa, if this reaches you, then something has happened I hoped never would. If they've been cruel to you, if they've tried to silence you, then I need you to remember this. You owe them nothing, not your grace, not your name, not your strength. But if the day comes when you find peace, when you look at them and feel only stillness, not fire, then that will be your greatest victory, not for me, for you. And if you do forgive them, it won't make you weak. It'll be the thing that makes me most proud to have loved you. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't move me, it did, but because the tears had already been shed. In the nights I spent curled in a smoke-scented coat, in the courtroom gripping Walter's hand, in the quiet hours after Celeste walked away from the porch, envelope in hand and her eyes hollow. I folded the letter back along its original creases, smoothing the edges gently with my thumbs. Then I stood, crossed the room, and placed it beside the old typewriter on the writing desk. That desk had become a ritual. Every evening I sat there, recording the day's little truths, the sound of new voices echoing down the hall, the sight of two women planting lavender with matching gloves, the laughter of Delilah scolding the oven for its mood swings. Each page a quiet rebellion against the idea that women like us had nothing left to say. The letter sat beside the typewriter now, just above the ribbon spool. I didn't need to frame it or hide it. Its presence was enough. Later that night, as the house dimmed and everyone turned in, I lit a small lamp and returned to my desk. The keys clicked softly beneath my fingers as I typed. Today, I remembered the man who told me that silence could be strength, but also that mercy could be power. He left me a letter. But what he really gave me was permission to feel the full spectrum of being human. And today, I chose to forgive. Not because they asked, not because they earned it, but because I'm still here, and that matters more. I paused, looking down at the words. They weren't perfect, but neither was Richard, neither was I, neither was this life, and still, it was beautiful. Outside the window, the wind stirred the trees gently. Somewhere in the hallway, I heard the soft creak of floorboards, someone making tea or perhaps walking off a dream. The world moved quietly, and for once, I didn't feel like I had to race to meet it. I reached for the letter again, pressed my fingers to its edge, and whispered, not to the room, not to the walls, but to the man who once believed I'd be the one to carry the weight no one else could see. Thank you, I said. Then I turned off the lamp. The envelope was thicker than most, the handwriting tight and deliberate. I recognized it instantly, Gregory's script. There was no return address, no flourish, just my name. No mom, no Willa, just the distance between us sealed with a stamp. I waited until after the sun had begun dipping behind the trees to open it. The cabin was quiet then, the women resting, the wind pushing against the porch beams like a gentle reminder to keep breathing. Inside, his letter was restrained, but honest. I'm not writing for money. I'm not writing for land. I just want to ask you one thing, and I need to hear it from you, not from old documents or lawyers. Why did he believe in you more than he believed in me? There was no accusation for once, no biting sarcasm or rehearsed victimhood, just a raw question from a man still chasing the shadow of a father who once asked him to grow up too fast. I read the letter twice, maybe 3 times before folding it gently and setting it next to my teacup. I didn't write back. I didn't try to explain in paragraphs what took years to unravel. I didn't send a timeline of trust earned or battles fought. Instead, I asked Delilah to prepare an invitation for the Wednesday evening session, a group therapy circle held in the garden room every week. That week's topic was the eldest child who wasn't seen. The session was often quiet, sometimes tearful. Not many spoke, but they always stayed until the end. I left the invitation unsigned, addressed only with a small note. You asked the right question. Come listen to others asking it too. Walter dropped it in the mailbox for me. I didn't expect him to show. I wasn't sure if I even wanted him to. Forgiveness was one thing. Reopening the wound was another. But healing doesn't ask for permission. The next morning, I walked out early with a cup of mint tea and stood by the front fence. Fog still laced the field beyond, the tree line, the air thick with the smell of pine and wet earth. And there, hanging from the wooden post where we usually tied seasonal banners, was a white handkerchief, folded then pinned open like a small, quiet flag. No note, no signature, just a symbol, universal and unmistakable. I didn't take it down. I didn't tell anyone who left it. That morning, as the sun began to burn off the fog and the cabin stirred with laughter from the kitchen, I found myself walking back to the writing desk. I sat down, placed my tea beside the typewriter, and began to type. Not for the journal this time, not for the Foundation's newsletters, just for me. Some wounds don't bleed out loud. Some sons don't know how to ask for softness without armor. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for both of you is let them walk toward you in silence and meet them halfway without a single word. The white flag stayed for 3 days. Then it was gone. No one mentioned it. But at the Wednesday after that, one of the chairs in the back of the garden room had a coat draped over it, gray, neatly folded, and I let it be. The sun began its slow descent, casting a honey-colored light over the trees that lined the gravel path behind the cabin. The cicadas were humming softly, and the porch steps creaked as I made my way down, cane in one hand, notebook in the other. Delilah had finished planting lavender near the old mailbox. The scent lingered faintly in the breeze. I paused there for a moment, watching a few of the residents hang sheets on the line, their laughter carrying through the open air like wind chimes. The cabin looked nothing like the one I was once trapped in. The walls were warm now, painted in hues of soft pine and golden oak. The broken windows had been replaced with wide panes that let in the morning light. The trapdoor that once hid the plans for my survival now held extra blankets and photo albums. I walked the perimeter slowly, hand grazing the wooden railing. Walter had helped rebuild it, twice in fact. The first time he overestimated his measurements and everything leaned slightly to the left. We kept it that way for a week just for the laughs. I often found myself walking this loop at dusk. It grounded me. Let me remember who I was and how far I had come, not in miles, in breath, in decision, in still being here. A few feet past the garden, there was a bench beneath an ash tree. That was where I liked to sit and think, without urgency, without fear. The birds no longer scattered when I moved. The wind no longer startled me. The silence no longer felt like punishment. I sat, tucking my skirt gently beneath my knees, and opened my notebook. My hand trembled slightly now when I wrote, but I didn't mind. It slowed me down, made me choose my words with care. I've told this story not because I want to relive it, but because I need to live beyond it. There's a difference. I think sometimes people look at women like me, gray-haired, weathered, soft-spoken, and assume we are the remains of something, a love that ended, a family that fell apart, a house that emptied, a fire that took too much. But I am not remains. I am what remained. They thought I was just some old woman burned in the woods, but they don't know. I am memory survived, and I am still writing.